Hello, my biblical history students. I wanted to make a little video for you today to kind of recap what we've been going over in both in Module 2 and actually right now in Module 3. Right now you're finishing up Chapter 11, and really Module 2 and 3 really covers the entire historical scope of the Old Testament. After this we'll be getting into the New Testament. That's the Witherington book, the other book that you have. But there's a lot of stuff in the Old Testament when it comes to history, obviously, and most of you you've been doing the work. You seem to be grasping it. But that being said, there's a lot of stuff there, and if you're like me, when I was growing up, high school and college, Old Testament history was like a blur. You know, I knew David and Goliath, I knew Solomon, but I didn't really have a historical grid to really grasp it, and because I didn't have that, you didn't really understand the underlying issues that go into understanding biblical history. And so, you know, obviously that's what the Proven book is going in detail over, and like I said, hopefully you are getting it. It seems like you are, but I just wanted to hit a few highlights. So I want to take a few minutes to kind of go back, starting in Chapter 6, this is Module 2, and then just say a few things I want to emphasize in these past two modules. If I haven't said it before, and if I didn't, I know I said it in some of the comments at some point, the best way, the most simple way to understand how to go about understanding what the Old Testament is doing in terms of history. You know, this goes back to Module 1. It's not straight newspaper history reporting, but it's not completely made-up fiction, literary stuff alone. You have to see it as both. And the best example I can give is you think of modern movies. I always use this one. The recent movie Hacksaw Ridge, the World War II movie about Private Doss. That is a historical movie. It's a movie about a real historical event. But at the same time, in the telling of the story of that historical event, Mel Gibson, the producer, director, probably both, he shapes that history into a coherent narrative and a coherent story. And in doing so, sometimes he kind of makes up some dialogue between Private Doss and his father. It's generally there historically, but there's a little bit of artistic license going on. And so when you read these historical books in the Old Testament, you have to read them like that. They're about history, but they are very creative, and you have to kind of weigh both things together to kind of get a grasp, because the Old Testament is not just doing history for history's sake. It's telling about the Israelite history to talk about what they believe about God and how He has involved Himself in their history. And another thing I should mention, it's called the Deuteronomistic history. Basically, what that is, in Old Testament speak, the book of Deuteronomy is believed to have been the book of the law that Josiah found in 627 BC. Okay, and the themes, the main themes found in Deuteronomy are found also in Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. All that is called the Deuteronomy. I cannot say it. The Deuteronomy history. Let's put it that way. I can never say that word. Deuteronomistic. And basically what that means is when it was put together. Okay, you have the book of Deuteronomy found in 627. But then by 598 or 587, Judah gets taken into exile in Babylon. Now, this is a very fundamental thing you have to realize if you want to understand all these books. When the Jews find themselves in exile in Babylon, they thought that they were the people of Yahweh, the people of God, and that they were supposed to do these great things. And now they're in exile under foreign rule. And so the natural question for the Jews in exile is, how did we end up here? We thought we were the people of God. What went wrong? And so therefore, during the exile, and this would be between 587 and 539 BC, that's when these books, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, were compiled and put together. They weren't written out of whole cloth, because if you read 1st and 2nd Kings, for example, almost after every king that's mentioned, at the very end it says, for the rest of the works of King so-and-so, consult this book. We don't have the annals of the kings of Israel or Judah anymore. But what you find in 1st and 2nd Kings is the writers in the exile were taking information from their history and fashioning it into these books. And so therefore, what you are seeing in the Deuteronomy history is works that are addressed, that are written to, that are the works that are written to address the fundamental question: how did we end up in exile? And when you read it that way, you realize what's going on in these books, what themes are being emphasized about their history. That's why as you're seeing in the books of 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Samuel with Saul, David, and Solomon, why so much time is spent focusing on a lot of the bad things they did. So why are we in exile? Well, just look at our history. Even our great kings did horrible things. So it's kind of a reality check, and it's answering that question. Now, just keep that in mind when you're doing biblical history. When you're looking at all this stuff, look at it as history, look at it as literature, and understand when the bulk of it was written during the exile, looking back on their history. And another thing I should mention, it's not mentioned in the Proven book, but in the Hebrew Bible, Joshua, Judges, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings are listed under the subtitle of the prophets, the former prophets. Now you might think, how are those books prophetic? We thought prophecy was just future telling. That's a whole other issue. But what you need to realize about these books of the Deuteronomy history is, think of it this way. The people in the exile, when they compile these books, they are looking back at their history, and they're compiling these works to try to explain how they ended up in exile. And so in that case, they are prophetic interpretations of their past to make sense of the present. So, that being said, let's kind of go through some of these chapters, some of the things I want to make sure you highlighted. In chapter 6, he talks about the patriarchs and the Exodus, basically. And there's a question of the dating. How do we understand the story of the patriarchs? Proven talks about the best way to view it as theological history. And I would add theological history within a literary narrative framework. And again, you get that history and literature at the same time. As far as the Mosaic authorship of the books of Moses, these are the first 5 books, if you remember, he says that's not really necessary. It can't be proven. It's ultimately irrelevant. Personally, I think the first 5 books of the Bible, they probably go back to the time of the Exodus and Moses in some form. But what we have now has obviously been shaped and edited over time, and that's okay. As far as the dating goes, if you just take the strict numbers given in the Bible, the patriarchs would be Abraham to Joseph would be about 2100 to 876 BC. The time in Egypt would be from 876 to 446, and the Exodus would have been 1446 to 1406. Now again, those are the dates if you take them strictly, literally, chronologically, and that might be the case. But with these dates, the easiest way to understand is they're a little foggy. We don't know for certain. The best thing that Proven mentioned is the patriarchs were probably sometime between 2100 and 1500 BC, and then you fit the Exodus and the Exodus in that time frame. But it is a little fuzzy, and we have to be okay with that. But that's the general time period. Another thing I want to point out is when he was talking about the Exodus, specifically the numbers. It's a translation question. If most translations have it as the people coming out of Egypt were like roughly 600,000, 550 men plus women and children. So that's with that 603, 550,000 1,000 men, it's assumed that if you add women and children, oh my gosh, there's 2 million people. And then there's the question, how could anybody believe 2 million people come out of Egypt and wander around the Sinai desert for 40 years? It sounds kind of ludicrous. But again, translational-wise, there's that the Hebrew word for 1,000 can also mean clan or family. And so it's a proven suggestion, I think it's pretty convincing, that what it is saying is 603 families came out plus 550 officers. And then if you do the math, it comes out probably around 22,000 people came out of Egypt, which is interesting because even though Proven doesn't mention this, but around that time, in the 15th, 13th century, I don't know how they could figure this out, but somehow they figured out that the population in Canaan increased by around that much. So that kind of lends credibility to a smaller group coming out of Egypt, eventually making their way to Canaan. As far as the conquest, and this is chapter 7 of Joshua is concerned, again, the key thing you have to remember, it is history, but it's highly stylized literary narrative, and you have to keep this in balance. And the best way that Proven tried to explain it is there was an initial moving into Canaan and fighting battles and occupying a certain amount of the land, but it wasn't complete subjugation. That took time over, a couple generations. And I was thinking about it. If you want to equate it with kind of like U.S. history, the colonies were established on the eastern coast, and they were there for a while. And then over time, there was battles with the Indians, and eventually we took over most of the continent, but it didn't happen all at once. So even when you hear about, manifest destiny, it sounds like it's this big crusade all at once. We speak in those terms to kind of simplify our history, but the reality is a little more messy. And so that's what his point was in chapter 7, is there was an initial going into and fighting battles, a conquest, if you will, but that word is a little too much. So that's another interesting thing to realize. One other thing about the conquest, it's really important to understand the significance of the word harem, that it's mostly, some English translations translate it as total destroyed. That's not really what it means. It means devoting to the ban. It means removing from use. And when you read the conquest narrative of Joshua in that light, what you realize is what he's doing is when they move in and they have battles, they wipe out the Canaanite pagan structure, but they only completely burn down a handful of towns. They only completely destroy a handful of towns. And so, again, it requires a more critical thinking when you read this material. As far as Saul and David is concerned, there's not much I want to emphasize there. I think it's straightforward, but it is interesting to point out that with Saul, right from the beginning, the narrative about how they establish a king, there's a designation, demonstration, and then confirmation. Right at the beginning, there's warning flags everywhere with Saul. He looks the part, but right from the beginning, you sense he has some character flaws that lead into his tragic downfall. And then with the David story, there was a question about, was it really a great empire? Again, we kind of read into the Bible sometimes stuff that isn't there. We shouldn't think of the Davidic Empire as like the Roman Empire. It was a small little kingdom. And the other interesting thing about David is obviously, even though he's called a man after God's own heart, the story itself really highlights a lot of his flaws. So despite what some scholars say, it's not a cushy propaganda piece that's all pro-David. They show him warts and all, which again kind of lends credibility, I think, to the historical nature of it. Chapter 9, which you recently did about Solomon, again, this is one of the interesting differences between 1st and 2nd Kings, which was composed during the Exile, which was trying to answer the question, how did we end up here? The difference between that and something like 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which is about the same king period, but it's a lot more positive. And the reason why is because 1st and 2nd Chronicles, it's believed, was written after the exile was over, when they were back in the land and they were struggling. Now, and this explains the difference in the tone. First and Second Kings, how did we end up here? We had a sinful past. So when you read First and Second Kings, there's a lot of pointing out of the flaws in the past. When you look at First and Second Chronicles, it's all really positive. You know, David and Solomon, they wanted to build a temple, and oh, they were godly, and look at this awesome temple. And it kind of ignores a lot of the negative stuff. Why is that? Because after they got back to Judea after the exile, the returning exiles were struggling a lot, and they were kind of facing depression, I guess you could say. You know, they were having a hard go of it. And so First and Second Chronicles is written about their history, but it's much more of a positive spin. It's more like that halftime pep talk when you're getting your butt kicked in a game. You know, First and Second Chronicles is saying, look at David, he was great. Look at Solomon, he was great. Stay faithful, and you could be great again. And so if you want to understand the historical lens, what's the difference between First and Second Kings and First and Second Chronicles, that explains why they're different. There's a lot of, I'm not going to go through all the history that these next two chapters go into, but I do want to emphasize, because there was a question and some interesting thoughts on the figure of Solomon. When you actually read about his reign in 1 Kings 1 through 11, when you read it closely, it really is interesting. The writer, on one hand, he says, yes, Solomon was a great king, and he was wealthy and really wise, and he walked in, you know, the ways of his father David. But all along, when you read it closely, there are little hints that there were some not so good things about Solomon. The way he came into power, if you read those chapters, those are interesting. The first thing he does once he establishes himself, he marries Pharaoh's daughter. As a Jew, that should be a big red flag. And then on top of that, we're told that he continued to worship on the high places. He married a lot of foreign women, which was against the law, the Deuteronomy law. And therefore, he brought in a lot of pagan worship. And it's one of those things where you see the influence a king has. This is kind of speculation, but you can almost think that Solomon thought, I have these foreign wives as political alliances, and I'll build little pagan shrines for them. I know there's only one God, Yahweh, but for them, I'll do that. But the effect that had on the populace, if you're just a commoner and you see your king making pagan shrines, what are you going to be thinking? Well, I guess it's okay to worship pagan shrines. And that feeds into one of the common themes throughout 1st and 2nd Kings, is why they're always falling into pagan idolatry, because it was always there, because their kings, you know, put it forth. But the point is, one other thing with Solomon, even in the talk about how he built the temple of Yahweh and how it was really great, he spent 7 years building the temple of Yahweh, and then right after that, the writer says, and he built his own house, which took 14 years. What does that tell you? Who is he valuing more, himself or the temple? But the point is, when you read the Solomon story closely and critically, you realize that kind of the seeds of discord and rebellion that happened right after he died, they were sown during his time period. The way he enslaved his people to create his building projects, he became kind of like Pharaoh, and that's the problem. Anyway, chapter 10, which you just did, is all about the divided kingdom, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. It is interesting that as soon as Jeroboam breaks away, becomes king of the north, one of the first things he does to make sure his people don't go to the temple in the south, he creates 2 shrines, golden calf shrines. What does that tell you? That old golden calf worship from Sinai never really went away. It was part of their culture. And interestingly enough, if you look at the description of all the kings in 1st and 2nd Kings, every single king of the north is considered a bad king who walked in the ways of Jeroboam. It's a comment on that they kept the golden calf shrines. Personally, there might have been a couple kings who were nice people, but the point that 1st Kings is getting at about their history is the northern kingdom continually had these golden calf shrines, and therefore they were, cheating on Yahweh, and they weren't worshiping at the temple. That's the point of that. Another really important thing that is a watershed moment in Old Testament history that most people just are completely clueless about, is what is called the Syro-Ephraimite crisis. This is mid-8th century when King Ahaz of Judah comes to the throne. He's threatened from Israel and another country, Aram or Syria. And basically what happens is, and this is talked about in the prophet Isaiah, incidentally, same story. Isaiah comes to him and he says, put your faith in Yahweh and he will protect you from these two kings. And Ahaz says, I don't think so. I'm going to call on Assyria, who was the major world power at the time. And because Ahaz invites Assyria in to help him, he kind of brings in a mob boss who never goes away. And the Syro-Ephraimite crisis is crucial because it explains how Assyria came to dominate the region. Along with that, I think I put this in the note of everybody's homework, the question of Hezekiah's reign. There's a huge question because if you read on the surface of it, it doesn't make sense. It says that he reigned for 29 years, that in his 6th year, the northern kingdom fell, and the northern kingdom fell in 721, so you would think, oh, he must have started his reign in 727. But then later on, when it talks about Sennacherib's invasion, it was his 14th year. Well, Sennacherib's invasion was 701. Well, if it's his 14th year, that would make it 715. So there's this natural chronological question. When did Hezekiah, when was he king? Did he start in 727 or did he start in 715? And scholars debate this all the time. I actually tackled this question in part of my PhD. Proven puts forth the idea that maybe he came to be king in 727, but he was a co-regent with his father Ahaz until 715 when he became the sole king, and therefore it works out. If you do that, it creates a whole bunch of other chronological problems. I tend to think that basically it's a scribal error. If you read in Hebrew, and obviously I can't explain it, but the word for 14th, like Hezekiah's 14th year, the difference between 14th and 24th is literally like one little stroke. And so I tend to think that he became king in 727, the northern kingdom fell in 721, his 6th year, and then in his 24th year, which would have been 703, that's when he rebelled against Assyria, and then that whole Sennacherib's invasion played out in the next couple of years. I think that fits with the chronology, but it's an example of that kind of thing with Hezekiah's reigns is what causes scholars to question the historicity of a lot of the stuff. It's not clear. But if, a little critical thinking, a little studying, a lot of it can be explained, at least in a reasonable way, that it still maintains that, yes, there's something historical about this that's stable enough that we can grasp. Okay. Finally, when you get to the end of the divided kingdom, coming up to the exile, if you really want to keep it simple, ending with Josiah. Josiah comes, he starts his reforms in 727, or 627 BC. And he's considered a great king because he's, doing Yahweh reforms. Proven doesn't mention this specifically, but I want to mention it. Things seem to be going well. In 612, Assyria, Nineveh, the capital of Assyria, gets trashed by Babylon because Assyria as an empire is crumbling and Babylon's the new empire. And so if you're a Jew, from the kingdom of Judah, and you have your king Josiah turning to Yahweh, yay, then your oppressor Assyria is getting crumbled in 612, yay. And then in 605, the Battle of Carchemish is when Babylon finally crushed Assyria for good. You're thinking this is great, but, I skipped something. Let me go back. 627, he starts his Yahweh reforms. Yay. 612, Nineveh falls. Yay. But then all of a sudden, the tragedy is that in 609, Josiah gets killed in battle. All of a sudden, these great hopes of Judah all of a sudden gets crushed. And after 609, everything goes downhill right after that. 605, the Battle of Carchemish, Babylon crushes Assyria for good, and Babylon's the new big dog. And within time, Babylon comes down, takes over the region, and literally within about 20 years, you go from the glory of Josiah to complete destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. Within 20 years. And so when you read that history, both in the Bible and then in the Proven book, just put that in context. 20 years ago was 9/11, basically. Within that time period, all that stuff that you read happened. It's pretty amazing. Okay. Anyway, what you're doing right now is the final chapter on the exile. Pay attention to the scope of the deportation. We tend to think, oh, the deportation, millions of people got taken into exile. In reality, it was a few thousand of the elites, the poorest of the poor, who was the majority of the people. They stayed in the land. Keep that in mind. The exile happened from 587 to 539. In 539, Persia takes over. It's the new empire. Cyrus the Great says that the Jews can return. And so the returning exiles who come back from exile, they're like the elites, the highbrow Jews. And when they come back to the land, the situation in the land, the poorest of the poor have been living there for a couple generations, and that creates a conflict. And that's what he's going to talk about in chapter 11. And just to be clear, another historical timeline that you need to know, 539, they come back from the exile, and they start beginning to rebuild the temple. 10 years later, in 529, when Cyrus dies, the new king, I forgot who Proven says it is, the new king halts the rebuilding of the temple because there was conflict going on in the land, and some people who didn't like the returning Jews convinced the king to order that it not be rebuilt. And so what you have is 539, they get back to the land, they start rebuilding the temple. 529, it's ordered to be stopped. 520, when King Darius comes to be the king, the Jews in the land do something really cheeky. When he becomes king, they just start rebuilding the temple without asking for permission. And so when word gets back to Darius, hey, did you give permission for them to rebuild this temple? He consults the Persian records, and he finds Cyrus's order that they can go back and rebuild the temple. But for some reason, he misses the order that it had to be stopped. So he just sees Cyrus's order, and he says, yeah, they can rebuild the temple. It kind of reminds me when I was a kid, modern analogy. When I was a little kid and I wanted to have treats like Twinkies or Ding Dongs or Ho-Hos, but it was getting close to dinner. I knew my mom would say no, so what I would do is I would wait until she went to the bathroom, then I'd go in the pantry and I'd get a Twinkie and I'd take a bite, and then I would knock on the door. It's like, hey Mom, can I have a Twinkie? And she would say, well, we're getting pretty close to dinner. And then I would say, well, I already took a bite. And then she would, okay, fine. So that's kind of what the Jews did to get their temple rebuilt. And then by 516, they rebuilt it. Okay, one last thing you need to realize when you read chapter 11, all that happens, like I said, between 539 and 516. That's when they move back to the land, they eventually rebuild the temple. When you finally get to Ezra, Nehemiah, and then the story of Esther, that happens in... Ezra came back to Judah in 458 and Nehemiah 445, and the whole story of Esther took place at that time. So you're talking about a good, 60 plus years from the time they originally came back and the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. So when you read Ezra and Nehemiah and that historical period, that's a generation or two after they came back. So it's a whole different situation. So pay attention to that. Do the homework. It's due tomorrow. I'll grade it as soon as possible. And then I'll probably send out a summary of what to expect on the Module 3 test covering 9, 10, and 11. Okay, this is a little long, but I hope this kind of clarifies a whole bunch of stuff. I hope you've enjoyed the Old Testament stuff. And then starting probably, I think, after next week we'll be getting into the New Testament stuff, which is a lot easier read. So, all right, thank you very much. Enjoy.